Ellie Rosewood was 23. She had $9 left. No home, no family, no plan. That morning, at a gas station outside a town called Miller's Bend, she spent 4 of those dollars on a box of matches and a single white candle. That left her $5 and a duffel bag holding everything she owned. But what she didn't know, walking up the cracked stone steps of the abandoned church at the edge of town, was that something had been waiting under that floor for almost 60 years, and it was about to change the rest of her life. Have you ever had a night where you didn't know where you'd sleep, and the only door left open to you was one nobody else wanted? That was Ellie's night. Before we go any further, if stories like this one mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. It helps more than you know. By morning, nothing about Ellie Rosewood's life would look the same again. She hadn't planned on the church. She'd planned on nothing really, because plans required a future you could still picture. And for months now, Ellie's future had narrowed down to a single question each day: where tonight? 3 months earlier, she'd been renting a room above a laundromat in Denton Falls, working 2 jobs, mornings at a diner, evenings restocking shelves at a hardware store, saving what she could in a coffee can under her bed. Then her car had died beyond repair. Then the diner had cut her hours. Then the man renting her the room had sold the building without warning, and the coffee can of savings had gone, dollar by dollar, into bus tickets and gas station meals until there was nothing left to save. She had no parents to call. Her mother had died when Ellie was 11, a car accident on a rain-slick highway that Ellie still sometimes dreamed about, waking with her chest tight and her hands curled into fists. Her father had never been in the picture at all, just a name on a birth certificate and a story her mother used to tell, half smiling, half sad, about a man who loved the road more than he loved staying. After her mother died, Ellie had gone into the foster system, bouncing through 4 homes in 7 years, before aging out at 18, with a garbage bag of clothes and a promise to herself that she would never again depend on anyone who could leave. It had made her strong. It had also made her hard to reach, and she knew it. She didn't ask for help. She didn't linger in one place long enough to be asked to. She kept her guard up the way other people kept a coat zipped against the cold, and when people were kind to her, some old, tired part of her waited for the moment they'd stop. The church sat half a mile past the edge of Miller's Bend, down a gravel road that had mostly gone to weeds. Ellie had noticed it the day before, walking into town looking for work that didn't exist, and she'd noticed too the faded "For Sale by County" back taxes sign nailed crookedly to the fence post, the paint on it as grey and peeling as the building itself. She hadn't thought much of it then. A boarded-up church wasn't useful to a girl with $5 and no plan. But by nightfall, with the temperature dropping and every motel in town wanting money she didn't have, the church stopped being scenery and started being the only door left. The lock on the side entrance had rusted through years ago. It gave with one hard shove of her shoulder, the door groaning like it hadn't been asked to open in a long time. Inside, the air smelled like dust and old wood, and rain that had gotten in through a hole in the roof and never quite left. Moonlight came down through a broken, stained glass window in patches of blue and red across the floor, and the pews, half of them still standing, threw long shadows toward the altar. Ellie stood in the doorway a long moment, duffel bag heavy on her shoulder, and let herself feel, just for a second, how far she'd fallen. 23 years old, sleeping in a stranger's church because it was the only roof she had left. She thought about crying. She didn't. Crying had never fixed anything, in her experience, and she was too tired to start now. She lit the candle instead, cupping the small flame with her hand as she walked the center aisle, boots scuffing through years of dust. The building was in rough shape, water damage along the back wall, a section of ceiling sagging dangerously over what used to be the choir loft, pews knocked sideways like something had come through here fast and never been cleaned up. But it was dry where she stood, and it was quiet, and quiet was worth something when you'd spent 3 months without much of it. She found a spot near the altar, out of the worst of the draft, and sat down with her back against the wall, candle set carefully on the floor beside her. It was there, easing her boots off and rubbing at a blister on her heel, that she noticed something odd about the floorboards under her. A seam that didn't match the rest, a section slightly raised, like it had been cut and reset by hand a long time ago and never quite settled flush again. She told herself it was nothing. Old buildings settled strangely. She was too tired to think about it tonight. She was wrong about it being nothing. She just didn't know that yet. What she did know, lying there in the dark with the candle burned low and her stomach empty and her whole life reduced to a duffel bag and $5, was that this was rock bottom. She'd had rock bottoms before. The night she left her last foster placement, the morning she found out about the laundromat building being sold. But this one felt different. This one felt like the end of something. Or maybe, though she couldn't have said why, the very beginning. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the broken window in its frame. Ellie closed her eyes. She had no idea that by the end of the week, this ruined little church, condemned, worthless, sold for the price of its unpaid taxes, would belong to her. And she had even less idea what was waiting for her, sealed beneath that uneven floorboard, 6 decades old and never found. Ellie woke to grey morning light slanting through the broken stained glass, and for one disoriented second, she forgot where she was. Then her back reminded her, stiff from the hard floor, and the smell of dust and old wood brought it rushing back. The church, the candle, burned down to a stub beside her. The $5 folded in her jacket pocket, all that stood between her and nothing. She sat up slowly, working the ache out of her shoulders, and took the building in properly for the first time in daylight. It was worse than she'd thought, and somehow also less frightening. The water damage along the back wall was extensive, dark stains climbing the plaster like something reaching upward, and the ceiling above the choir loft had a soft, swollen look that told her rot had been working at it for years. Half the pews were split or overturned. Bird droppings streaked one entire corner, where a gap in the roof had clearly let generations of sparrows come and go as they pleased. And yet the bones of the place were good. She could see that now in the daylight, in a way she hadn't been able to in the dark. Thick oak beams overhead, a stone foundation that hadn't shifted, tall windows that, even broken, let in more light than she'd expected. Someone had built this to last. Someone just hadn't been around to keep it lasting. She thought again of the uneven floorboard near where she'd slept, and crouched to look at it in daylight. It was as she remembered, a seam that didn't match the surrounding wood, edges slightly rounded from age, like it had been lifted and reset more than once. She pressed on it with her palm. It held firm, didn't budge. Whatever curiosity she felt, she didn't have the tools or the time to chase it, not on an empty stomach with $5 to her name. She filed it away and stood, brushing dust from her jeans. Miller's Bend, she'd learned walking in the day before, was small, a single main street, a diner, a hardware store, a gas station, a scattering of houses fanning out into farmland. She needed food, and she needed to understand what, exactly, she was trespassing in. The gas station clerk from the morning before, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a name tag that read Dale, looked up when the bell over the door rang, and gave her a once-over that wasn't unkind, just curious. Small towns noticed strangers. She bought a granola bar and a bottle of water, $1.40, leaving her $3 and change, and asked, as casually as she could manage, about the church at the edge of town. Old St. Aidan's? Dale scratched his jaw. Been empty long as I can remember. County took it for back taxes maybe 6, 7 years ago now. Nobody wanted it. Structures shot, roofs worse. They've had it listed at auction twice, and nobody's bid. He squinted at her. Why, you interested? Ellie said she was just curious. She didn't mention she'd slept there. She didn't mention that something about the building, its stubbornness maybe, still standing after all these years of being unwanted, had lodged itself somewhere in her chest overnight and hadn't let go. But she found herself, an hour later, standing outside the small county annex office, 2 doors down from the diner, reading a notice taped inside the glass door, property auction, parcel 1114, St. Aidan's Chapel and 2.3 acres, minimum bid $1, contact county clerk, $1. She almost laughed out loud, standing there on the sidewalk. A church, and the land under it, for less than the granola bar she'd just eaten. It made a kind of sense that stung a little. Nobody wanted a building that took more to fix than it was worth. Nobody but a girl, with nowhere else to be. She went inside. The clerk was an older woman named Patricia Hollis, reading glasses pushed up into grey hair, who looked at Ellie with open surprise when she asked about parcel 1114. You want to bid on St. Aidan's? I have $1, Ellie said, and something about saying it out loud, how small it sounded, how absurd, made her almost smile for the first time in days. Patricia studied her for a long moment, the kind of look that took in the duffel bag still slung over Ellie's shoulder, the wrinkled clothes, the tired eyes. Ellie braced for pity, or worse, questions. Instead, Patricia just sighed and pulled out a form. Nobody else has bid on it in 2 years, she said. County'd probably pay you to take it off the books, if I'm honest. There's a form, and a 3-day waiting period for anyone else to counterbid, which nobody will, and then it's yours. Taxes on it are current. County ate the back debt when they seized it. You'd just be buying the parcel outright, clean. Ellie signed where she was told to sign, and handed over her $1 like it was the strangest transaction of her life, which it was. Patricia gave her a receipt, told her the deed would process in a few business days once the waiting period cleared, and then, almost as an afterthought, not quite meeting Ellie's eyes, said, You got somewhere to stay meantime, hun? I'm fine, Ellie said, too quickly, the old reflex kicking in before she could stop it. Patricia didn't push. Small towns, Ellie was learning, had a way of not pushing and also not quite letting go. She spent that first full day walking the 2.3 acres that would soon, on paper, belong to her. The land ran back from the church into a stand of old oaks, sloping gently toward a dry creek bed choked with brush. There was a smaller structure behind the chapel, a caretaker's cottage, she guessed, windows boarded, roof sagging on one side but not collapsed, and a stone well, capped, near what must once have been a garden. It was a ruin. She made herself see that clearly, walking it, cataloguing every crack and rot spot and broken thing, because some old survival instinct in her distrusted hope, distrusted the soft, unfamiliar feeling rising in her chest as she stood in the middle of all that overgrown, forgotten land and thought, for the first time in longer than she could remember, this is mine, not rented, not borrowed, not something a landlord could sell out from under her with 2 weeks' notice. Hers. It didn't erase the fear. She still had less than $3, no food beyond what Dale's gas station could stretch to, and a building that might collapse around her ears if she wasn't careful. But standing there in the ruined chapel yard, duffel bag at her feet, Ellie Rosewood felt something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. Not quite hope, not yet, but the shape hope might eventually fill. That evening, she went back into the church, as the sun dropped low and orange through the broken windows, and she started, in the smallest way, to clean. She righted overturned pews. She swept the worst of the debris from the center aisle with a broken branch, since she had no broom. She found an old tin bucket, rust-spotted but sound, and set it under the ceiling gap to catch rain instead of letting it pool on the floor. She did not go back to the uneven floorboard that day, but she thought about it, once, sweeping past it in the fading light, noticed how her eye kept catching on that seam, that raised edge, like some part of her already sensed there was more to this church than water damage and bird droppings and a rot-soft roof. She had no way of knowing, that first evening, cleaning a ruin she'd bought for $1, that the real inheritance waiting for her here had nothing to do with the land at all, and everything to do with what someone had hidden beneath it, and why. 3 days passed before the deed cleared, and Ellie spent all of them at St. Aidan's. She'd found, on her second morning, a rhythm that surprised her with how much it steadied her. She woke with the light through the broken window, drank water from the bottle she refilled at Dale's station each morning for the privilege of buying something small, and worked until her hands ached and the sun dropped low enough that she needed the candle again. There was something in the physical labor, sweeping, hauling, righting what had been knocked down, that quieted the part of her brain that otherwise spent all day calculating how many dollars she had left and how many days that might buy her. The answer, by the third morning, was not many. She was down to $1.60, and the granola bars from Dale's had stopped feeling like enough. She hadn't told him, or Patricia, or anyone in Miller's Bend how bad it had gotten, because telling people meant needing them, and needing people had never worked out well for Ellie Rosewood. It was Dale, in the end, who noticed anyway. She'd come in on the third afternoon to buy her usual bottle of water, counting out the coins carefully on the counter, and Dale had watched her do it with an expression she recognized and hated. Not quite pity, but close enough to it that her spine straightened on instinct. "You eating all right out there?" he asked, too casual, wiping down the counter that didn't need wiping. "I'm fine," Ellie said, the same too quick answer she'd given Patricia. Dale didn't argue with her. He just reached under the counter, pulled out a paper bag, and set it beside her water bottle. "Day-olds," he said, not quite meeting her eye. "Sandwiches I can't sell tomorrow anyway. Rather they go somewhere than the trash." It would have been easy to see it as pity, and some old, guarded part of her wanted to. But there was something matter-of-fact in the way Dale said it, like feeding a stranger cost him nothing and he wasn't going to make a thing of it, and something in Ellie loosened just slightly, enough that she said thank you and meant it, and took the bag. That night, eating a day-old turkey sandwich by candlelight in the nave of a church she now technically owned, Ellie allowed herself to think, for the first time, about what she actually wanted to do with this place. It wasn't a fully formed thought yet. It was more of a feeling, the way the light came through the tall windows in the late afternoon, gold and warm, despite the broken glass, the way the old oak beams overhead, when she really looked at them, seemed less like decay and more like something waiting to be noticed again. She had nowhere else to be. She had, as of 3 days ago, a piece of land that was legally hers, however worthless everyone else considered it, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she had a reason to wake up in the morning that wasn't just survival. She started, cautiously, to imagine fixing it up. Not for any grand purpose. She didn't let herself think, yet, about what a restored chapel might actually be for. Just the idea of it. A roof that didn't leak, windows with glass in them, a door that locked properly so she could sleep without one ear listening for footsteps on the gravel outside. The deed came through on the fourth day. Patricia called the number Ellie had given her. A second-hand flip phone Ellie had bought for $8, 2 towns back. One of her last real purchases before things got desperate, and told her, in a voice that still carried a note of disbelief, that Parcel 1114, St. Aidan's Chapel, and 2.3 acres, officially belonged to Ellie Rosewood. "Congratulations," Patricia said, and then, more gently, "You sure you're all right out there, hun? That building's not exactly livable." "I'll manage," Ellie said, and this time it didn't feel like a lie so much as a promise she intended to keep. She celebrated, in her own quiet way, by walking the full 2.3 acres again, this time more slowly, trying to see it not as a ruin, but as a beginning. The caretaker's cottage behind the chapel drew her attention longest. Smaller, more human-scaled than the church itself, its boarded windows and sagging roofline somehow less intimidating than the chapel's soaring, damaged grandeur. If she could get one room of it livable, she thought, she wouldn't have to sleep on a church floor much longer. She found a crowbar in the cottage's small lean-to shed, rust-spotted but usable, and spent the rest of that day prying boards off the cottage's windows, letting light flood into rooms that hadn't seen it in years. Dust hung thick in the beams of sun. A family of mice had clearly called the place home at some point, though there was no sign of them now. The floor was sound, at least in the front room, and the roof, while it needed real work eventually, wasn't actively letting rain through, not yet. It was, she decided, somewhere she could survive. She met her first real skeptic that same evening, walking back toward town for water. A man in his 60s, weathered and sun-browned, driving a truck that slowed as it passed her on the gravel road. He rolled down his window, looked at her with open suspicion, and asked what business she had out at St. Aidan's. "I bought it," Ellie said, lifting her chin slightly, bracing for the reaction she'd start to become familiar with over the following weeks. The man, she'd later learn his name was Walt Bregman, who ran a small cattle operation on the land bordering the churches, snorted, not unkindly, but not warmly either. "Bought a money pit, is what you did. My daddy used to say that church was cursed, the way it eats money and gives nothing back. Counties tried to unload it twice." He shook his head, put the truck back in gear. "Good luck to you," he said, in a tone that suggested he didn't think luck would be enough. Ellie watched his taillights disappear down the road and felt the old, familiar tightening in her chest. The sense of being sized up and found wanting, of being one more thing this small town would watch fail. She'd felt that particular flavor of doubt aimed at her before, in foster homes, in jobs, in every place she'd ever tried to plant herself. It used to make her want to leave before anyone could tell her to. This time, standing on the gravel road in the fading light with the church's steeple visible behind her, dark against the sky, she felt something different rise up alongside the old hurt, something sharper, something that looked, if she was honest with herself, a little bit like defiance. Let them think it's a money pit, she thought, walking on toward town, toward Dale's station, and whatever day-old bread might be waiting for her. Let them watch. I've survived on less than this before. She didn't know yet how true and how surprising that stubborn thought would turn out to be, that the church everyone in Miller's Bend had written off as worthless was about to prove every one of them wrong, in a way none of them could have predicted, starting with what was still waiting, patient and undisturbed, beneath that one uneven floorboard near the altar. The first week became the first two, and Ellie's days folded into a rhythm shaped entirely by the church and the cottage behind it. She'd moved her sleeping spot from the nave to the cottage's front room by the end of the first week, once she'd swept it clean and patched the worst gap in the roof with a scavenged sheet of tin she'd found in the lean-to. It wasn't comfortable, not by any normal measure. She slept on a bedroll she'd bought second-hand in town for $3, the last of the cash she'd had left after the church purchase, and the nights still carried a chill that worked its way into her bones. But it was hers, and it was dry, and after a life spent in other people's spaces, that counted for more than comfort. Dale's day-old sandwiches became a quiet, unspoken arrangement. She'd stop by most evenings, and he'd have something set aside, without either of them making a show of it. She started doing small, odd jobs around town to earn a few dollars honestly, sweeping out the diner before opening, hauling boxes at the hardware store, anything that put a little cash in her pocket without requiring a resume or a fixed address. The diner owner, a stout, no-nonsense woman named Rosa Delgado, watched her work that first morning with a critical eye, and then, without comment, doubled what she'd offered to pay her. The hardware store owner, an older man named Hollis Greer, no relation to Patricia, small towns just recycled names that way, took a longer time to warm up. He watched Ellie the way Walt Bregman had watched her, like she was a problem the town hadn't asked for, but he sold her, at cost, a box of roofing nails and a tarp when she asked, and didn't comment on the state of her boots, and that was its own kind of kindness, even if he'd never have called it that. The work at the church itself was slower, and harder, and more humbling than she'd expected. She spent 4 full days just clearing debris from the nave, broken glass, rotted wood, decades of leaves blown in through the gap in the roof, hauling it out in the tin bucket, load by load, until her palms blistered and then calloused. She learned, through trial and error, and one very close call, that the choir loft's sagging section wasn't safe to stand on. She put her foot through a soft plank one afternoon and only caught herself on the railing at the last second, heart hammering, ankle twisted, but not broken. She sat on the nave floor afterward, shaking, and let herself cry for the first time since she'd arrived. Not from the pain, but from the sheer exhausting weight of doing this alone. She didn't call anyone. There was no one to call. She wrapped her ankle herself, using a strip of fabric torn from an old curtain, and rested it for 2 days, hobbling between cottage and church, furious at her own body for slowing her down when there was so much still to do. It was during those 2 forced days of rest, unable to do the heavier work, that she finally went back to the uneven floorboard. She'd noticed it that first night, and again a dozen times since, always at the edge of her attention, that raised seam near where the altar steps met the nave floor, the wood a slightly different grain than what surrounded it. With her ankle too sore for hauling debris, but sound enough to kneel, she finally gave herself permission to be curious about it. She used the flat edge of the crowbar, working it gently into the seam, half expecting the board to be nailed down tight and immovable. It wasn't. It lifted with surprising ease, like it had been lifted this way before, more than once, by hands that knew exactly where to press. Beneath it wasn't dirt or foundation stone, as she'd expected, but a shallow wooden cavity, deliberately built, a hidden compartment, no more than 2 feet square, fitted into the floor joists with a craftsman's care. Ellie sat back on her heels, heart suddenly loud in her ears. Inside the cavity, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth, and was now brittle and yellowed with age, sat a metal box, not large, maybe the size of a bread loaf, its surface pitted with rust, but its seams still tight, still sealed. Beside it, tucked against the cavity wall, was a second, smaller bundle, wrapped in cloth that had fared better, protected by its position beneath the metal box from decades of damp. Her hands were shaking as she lifted the metal box free. It was heavier than its size suggested, and something inside it shifted with a soft, dense sound when she tilted it, not the light rattle of papers, but something with real weight and substance. She set it carefully on the floor beside her and reached back into the cavity for the second bundle. She didn't open either one right away. She sat there instead, in a pool of late afternoon light, slanting gold through the tall windows, staring at what she'd just pulled out from beneath a church floor that everyone in Miller's Bend had written off as worthless. She thought about Walt Bregman's voice, flat and certain, bought a money pit. She thought about the county listing it twice at auction and finding no bidders. She thought about her own hands, blistered and calloused from 2 weeks of work, and the $3.60 that had been her entire net worth the day she'd walked up the church steps with nowhere else to go. Whatever was in that metal box, it had been hidden with intention, not lost, not forgotten, but deliberately placed and deliberately sealed by someone who had known exactly what they were doing and exactly where to put it so it wouldn't be found by accident. Her fingers found the box's latch. It resisted at first, stiff with rust and disuse, and then gave with a small, sharp click that seemed to echo through the empty nave. She lifted the lid. Inside the box, wrapped in strips of cloth gone soft and brown with age, were bundles of cash, bills bound with string, older bills, the paper thick and slightly discolored, but intact. Ellie's breath caught somewhere in her chest as she lifted the first bundle free and understood, with a kind of disbelieving slowness, exactly what she was looking at. She counted it there on the nave floor, the light shifting gold to amber as the afternoon wore on, her blistered hands trembling with something that wasn't quite joy and wasn't quite fear, but sat somewhere uneasy between the two. When she finished counting, she sat back against the altar steps and stared at the neat stacks arranged in front of her, unable, for a long moment, to make her mind accept the number. $41,200. She said it out loud, once, into the empty church, just to hear if it sounded real. It didn't. Nothing about the last 2 weeks of her life had sounded real, and this least of all. A girl who'd owned $3.60 2 weeks ago, sitting on the floor of a church she'd bought for a single dollar, staring at more money than she'd ever seen in one place in her life. Her first instinct, sharp and immediate, was suspicion. Money hidden this carefully, this deliberately, didn't happen by accident, and Ellie had learned the hard way that things that seemed too good to be true usually were. She checked the bills again, searching for some sign of what they were: stolen, counterfeit, evidence of something she didn't want to be tangled up in. But they looked, as far as she could tell, exactly like what they appeared to be: old, legally issued currency, saved and hidden by someone who'd had good reason to hide it. It was the second bundle, the one wrapped in cloth, tucked beneath the metal box in the cavity, that answered the question the money couldn't. She unwrapped it carefully, fingers still unsteady, and found a leather-bound journal inside, its cover soft and cracked with age, and a single folded letter tucked into its front pages, the paper gone thin and fragile at the creases. The handwriting on the letter was careful, old-fashioned, slightly shaky in places like the hand that wrote it hadn't always been steady. The hand, she would come to understand, of an old man near the end of his life, writing to someone he'd never met, and hoped, against long odds, might someday find these words. She unfolded it with the same care she might have used on something alive, and began to read. To whoever finds this, my name was Thomas Whitfield, and for 40 years I was the caretaker of this small church, though by the time you're reading this, I expect there won't be much church left to care for. I want you to know I tried. I patched what I could patch, and prayed over the rest, and when my knees gave out, and my hands stopped being steady enough for ladders, I still came, every morning, to sweep the steps, because a place matters less for what it's made of, and more for who refuses to give up on it. I never married, never had children of my own, though I buried enough of this town's sons and daughters over the years that I came to think of the whole congregation as mine, in the strange way an old man comes to love people he's only ever known through their grief and their gladness. When the county stopped funding upkeep and the roof started going, I knew this building's days as a working church were numbered, and I knew too that I didn't have much time left to do anything about it. So I saved. Every dollar I could spare from 40 years of small wages, I put aside instead of spending, and I hid it here, beneath this floor, because I didn't trust it to a bank that might fail, and I didn't have anyone to leave it to. No family, no children, no one who'd earned it by blood. I want you to understand something, whoever you are, reading this now. The money was never the point. I could have given it to the county, could have let them auction the land, and walked away with something to show for my life's savings. I didn't, because money spent on nothing but comfort disappears fast, and money spent on nothing at all disappears faster. What I wanted to leave behind wasn't wealth. It was a foundation, a place, however broken, that someone with nothing might be able to build something real on top of. The way I built 40 years of purpose, on top of a building nobody else believed in either. If you're reading this, it means you found your way here, the way I hope someone eventually would. Not because you had everything, but because you had nowhere else to go, and this old church, worthless as everyone called it, was still standing when you needed it to be. That's not an accident. Buildings like this one have a way of waiting for the person who needs them most. Use this to fix what's broken. Use it to build whatever this land is calling you to build. But don't mistake the money for the gift. The gift is the chance, the ground under your feet, and whatever you decide to do with it. That part was always going to be up to you. Take care of this place. Or don't. Build something new here instead, if that's what it needs to become. Either way, I hope you find here what I found. A reason to keep showing up, even when nobody else believes there's anything left worth showing up for. Thomas Whitfield Ellie read the letter twice through, and then a third time, and somewhere in the third reading her careful composure finally broke, and she cried, not the exhausted, frustrated tears of the day she'd twisted her ankle, but something deeper and less controlled, the kind of crying that came from being seen, unexpectedly and posthumously, by a stranger who'd never known her name. She thought of her mother, gone 12 years now, and the particular ache of growing up without anyone who'd chosen to stay. She thought of 4 foster homes in 7 years, of learning early that people who said they'd be there rarely were. And she thought of Thomas Whitfield, a man dead long before she was born, who had spent 40 years of small wages and quiet devotion building toward a moment he'd never live to see, toward her, specifically, though he could never have known her name or her face or the exact shape of the desperation that had brought her to his church's door. Buildings like this one have a way of waiting for the person who needs them most. She sat with that a long time, the letter loose in her hands, the money still stacked on the nave floor beside her, gone gold and quiet in the last of the afternoon light. It didn't erase what the last 3 months had cost her. It didn't erase 12 years of missing her mother, or 7 years of foster homes, or the particular loneliness of being 23 and entirely on her own in the world. But it changed something, all the same. Somewhere in Thomas Whitfield's careful, old-fashioned handwriting, Ellie Rosewood found the first real proof she'd had in a long time that showing up, even when nobody was watching, even when nothing seemed to be working, that it mattered, that someone, once, had believed it mattered enough to spend a lifetime on it. She wrapped the letter back in its cloth, gently, like something sacred, and looked up at the church around her, the broken windows, the water-stained walls, the oak beams overhead that had outlasted 40 years of one man's quiet devotion, and were, she understood now, waiting to outlast a great deal more. "All right, Thomas," she thought, wiping her face with the back of her hand, something steadier settling into her chest than anything she'd felt in months. "Let's see what we can build." The money changed the shape of Ellie's days, though not, at first, in the way she might have expected. She didn't rush into town and spend it. She sat with it for 2 full days, instead tucked back into its metal box and hidden, not beneath the floorboard again, which felt wrong now that she knew what it had cost Thomas Whitfield to hide it there, but in the cottage, under a loose floorboard of her own choosing, close enough to reach, but far enough from thoughtless spending, that she had to be deliberate every time she touched it. She made a plan, the way she'd learned to make plans in group homes and shared apartments, and every precarious situation she'd survived since aging out of foster care, carefully, in writing, on the back of an old church bulletin she'd found stuffed in a pew. Roof first. A church that let rain through wasn't a church that could hold anything else together. Then windows, then the worst of the structural rot along the back wall, then the cottage properly, then whatever came after that, which she didn't let herself imagine too clearly yet, because imagining too far ahead had never done her any favors. She went to Hollis Greer's hardware store with a list and, for the first time since she'd arrived in Miller's Bend, real money to spend. Hollis looked at her list, and then at her, with the same guarded skepticism he'd shown her from the start, clearly expecting her to walk out with a box of nails and a tarp, same as before. When she asked instead about roofing materials, lumber for structural repair, and whether he could recommend someone for the electrical work eventually, he set his pencil down and studied her for a long moment. "You planning on doing this yourself?" he asked. "That roof's a 2-person job, minimum. 3, if you want it done before winter." "I'll figure it out," Ellie said, which was mostly true, and mostly what she'd said about everything since she arrived. Hollis didn't argue with her, but he didn't quite let it go either. 2 days later, when Ellie was up on a ladder against the church's exterior wall, trying to assess the roof damage from below with a level of expertise she frankly didn't have, a truck pulled up the gravel drive and Hollis climbed out, along with a younger man he introduced as his nephew, Cody, who did roofing work on the side. "Not charging you full rate," Hollis said gruffly, before Ellie could even ask, cutting off the protest already forming on her lips. "Cody's between jobs anyway. Consider it a discount for buying local." It was, Ellie understood even then, a kindness dressed up as a business transaction, the particular currency small towns used when they wanted to help someone too proud to accept help outright. She let herself take it, which cost her something, but less than it would have 2 weeks earlier. The roof took 11 days, working with Cody most mornings and alone in the afternoons once he had other jobs to get to. She learned to nail shingles, to seal flashing, to identify rot by the give of wood under a screwdriver's point. Her hands, already calloused, grew rougher still, and something in her posture changed over those 11 days. Not confidence exactly, but a kind of settled competence, the look of someone who'd stopped being surprised by her own capability. Rosa Delgado, from the diner, started sending food out to the church some evenings. Not charity exactly. She was careful to frame it as payment for the vegetables Ellie had started clearing space to plant behind the cottage, though the trade was wildly uneven in Ellie's favor, and both women knew it. Dale kept the day-old sandwiches coming, even after Ellie no longer strictly needed them, until Ellie finally insisted on paying full price, and Dale, gruffly pleased, let her. Walt Bregman remained unconvinced. He drove past most days on his way to his own land, and more than once Ellie caught him slowing his truck to watch the roof work from the road, arms crossed, expression unreadable. He never stopped to help. He never stopped to talk, beyond the occasional gruff nod. But he never told her again that she'd bought a money pit either. And in Miller's Bend, Ellie was starting to understand. Silence sometimes meant more than words did. The setback came on the 14th day, with the roof nearly finished, and Ellie's confidence riding higher than it had in years. She was working alone that afternoon, Cody off on another job, finishing the last stretch of shingles along the church's north side, when the section of roof she was kneeling on, old wood she'd assumed was sound, hadn't checked as carefully as she should have, gave way beneath her without warning. She fell hard, through the weakened section, and down onto the choir loft below, the same loft whose sagging floor had already put her foot through a plank weeks earlier. This time, there was no railing to catch her. She hit the loft floor with her shoulder and her hip, pain exploding white and sharp, and lay there for several long seconds, staring up at the new hole in the roof, unable for a moment to process what had happened or how badly she was hurt. She managed, eventually, to sit up. Her shoulder screamed when she moved it, and a deep, spreading bruise was already blooming along her hip, but nothing felt broken. She could stand, could put weight on both legs, could flex her fingers even though her whole arm throbbed with every motion. She sat on the loft floor a long time anyway, shaking, the particular fear of being badly hurt with no one to call, rising up in her chest, the way it hadn't since her twisted ankle weeks before. It was Walt Bregman of all people who found her. He'd been driving past, he told her later, gruffly, like the explanation embarrassed him, and seen the new hole in the roof from the road, and figured something had gone wrong. He came up the loft stairs faster than a man his age should have been able to move, and when he saw her sitting there, favoring her shoulder, his weathered face went through something complicated. Worry, mostly, poorly disguised as irritation. "Told you that roof was a two-person job?" he said, gruff, kneeling to check her arm with more gentleness than his tone suggested. "Told Hollis, too. Man sends his nephew out here 3 days a week and leaves you swinging a hammer alone the rest of the time." "I'm fine," Ellie said, out of habit, and Walt gave her a look that told her exactly what he thought of that particular lie. He drove her into town himself, to the small clinic Miller's Bend shared with 2 other townships, and sat in the waiting room the entire time, arms crossed, refusing to leave until the doctor confirmed nothing was broken, just a deep bruise and a wrenched shoulder that would need a sling for a week or 2. When Ellie tried to thank him afterward, Walt just shrugged, already turning back toward his truck. "Don't thank me," he said. "Just don't fall through any more roofs. Miller's Bend's already lost enough people it didn't mean to lose. It wasn't warmth exactly, not the way Dale's sandwiches or Rosa's vegetables had been warmth. But it was something, from a man who'd called her project a money pit 2 weeks earlier, and Ellie understood, riding back to the church in his truck, with her arm in a sling, that something in Walt Bregman's assessment of her had shifted, even if he'd never say so directly. The sling came off after 10 days, though Ellie's shoulder ached with the changing weather for weeks afterward. A dull reminder, every time the wind shifted, that she wasn't invincible, however much the last month had started to make her feel that way. She'd used the forced rest, much as she had after her twisted ankle, to work on things that didn't require climbing or heavy lifting. She'd started clearing the overgrown garden plot behind the cottage, pulling weeds one-handed, awkward and slow, but steady. She'd begun sorting through the boxes of old church records she'd found in a cabinet near the vestry. Decades of baptism certificates, marriage records, handwritten notes from a string of pastors who'd served St. Aidan's before it closed its doors for good. Most of it was mundane, some of it, threaded through with Thomas Whitfield's careful, familiar handwriting in the margins of maintenance logs, felt like finding pieces of a man she was coming to know better through his absence than most people ever knew someone through their presence. She decided, somewhere in those 10 quiet days, what she wanted the church to become. It wasn't a decision that arrived all at once. It built the way the roof repairs had built, one piece settling into place at a time. She thought about Thomas's letter. Use it to build whatever this land is calling you to build. And she thought about her own life, about the string of temporary rooms and borrowed spaces that had defined it, about aging out of foster care with nothing and no one and nowhere that had ever felt like it was truly hers to stay in. She wanted to build somewhere for people like that, not a church in the old sense necessarily. She wasn't sure yet what shape it would take, but a place, a foundation, the way Thomas had meant it. Somewhere a person with nothing might land, the way she had landed, and find enough steadiness to stand back up. She didn't say this out loud to anyone at first. It felt too fragile a thing to survive being spoken, the way some ideas do, before they've had time to root. But she started shaping her repairs around it, quietly, clearing out the cottage's second room instead of leaving it storage space, thinking about the church's nave, not just as a building to be fixed, but as a space that might one day hold people again, gathered for something, even if she couldn't yet say what. Her shoulder healed enough, by the 3rd week of her recovery, to get back to real work, and the town's attitude toward her had shifted enough since the roof fall that help started arriving in small, steady ways she hadn't asked for and didn't quite know how to accept gracefully. Cody came by more often than the arrangement with Hollis technically required, teaching her framing and drywall alongside the roofing he'd already shown her. Rosa's evening food deliveries turned into actual dinners some nights, eaten together on the cottage's front step, while Rosa filled her in on decades of Miller's Bend history. Who'd married who'd left and come back, the slow unspooling of a town's memory that Ellie found herself hungry for in a way she hadn't expected. Even Hollis warmed by degrees, offering supplies at cost without being asked, then eventually refusing payment altogether on a load of lumber, waving off Ellie's protest with a gruffness that had started to feel more like affection than irritation. Walt Bregman's transformation was the slowest and, when it came, the most surprising. He showed up one Saturday morning unannounced, work gloves already on, and informed her flatly that he'd be helping with the fence line along the property's edge, whether she wanted him to or not, because a stretch of it had rotted through and he wasn't in the habit of watching a neighbor's fence fall down around her ears. Ellie learned, working alongside him that day and several days after, that Walt had lost a daughter years back. Car accident, he mentioned once, flat and final, offering no more detail than that, and clearly wanting none asked for. and that something about watching a young woman rebuild a ruin with her bare hands had reached a part of him he'd kept carefully closed off for a long time. He never said as much directly, but he started bringing tools without being asked, started staying longer than the day's task required, started, eventually, calling her by name instead of the vague hon or you he'd used those first weeks. It wasn't fatherly exactly. Ellie wasn't sure either of them would have accepted that word, but it was something adjacent to it, something neither of them examined too closely for fear of it evaporating under scrutiny. 6 weeks after she'd first walked up the church's cracked stone steps with $9 and a duffel bag, Ellie stood in the church's nave and looked at what 6 weeks of work, her own money, and a town's quiet, accumulating generosity had built. The roof was sound. The windows, replaced one by one with glass Hollis had sourced at cost, no longer let the weather in. The water damage along the back wall had been repaired, the rot cut out and replaced. The wall itself finally, structurally solid, for the first time in years. It wasn't finished. It wasn't close to finished. The cottage still needed real work. The grounds were still mostly overgrown, and Ellie's plan for what this place would actually become was still more feeling than blueprint. But standing in the nave with afternoon light falling clean and unbroken through new glass, for the first time in probably a decade, Ellie let herself feel something she'd been carefully rationing since she arrived. Pride, uncomplicated, and entirely her own. She thought of Thomas Whitfield's letter, which she kept now in the cottage, read often enough that she'd nearly memorized its careful, old-fashioned phrasing. Buildings like this one have a way of waiting for the person who needs them most. She understood that sentence differently now than she had the day she'd first read it. Sobbing on the nave floor, with $41,000 stacked in front of her. It wasn't just about her needing the church. It was about what she was building it into, and who else might someday need exactly this. A place, a foundation, a chance, however unglamorous, to start over from nothing. She didn't know yet how soon that theory would be tested, or how directly. She didn't know that within the month, a storm would roll through Miller's Bend, unlike anything the town had seen in a decade, and that everything she'd built in these 6 careful weeks would be measured against it. She only knew, standing in the clean afternoon light of a church that had been worthless 6 weeks ago and was worth something entirely different now, that she was no longer the same girl who'd climbed those cracked stone steps with $9 and nowhere left to go. The weeks that followed fell into something Ellie hadn't expected to find again so soon after everything she'd lost. A routine that felt less like survival and more like an actual life. She finished the cottage's 2nd room by the start of the 7th week, framing it out with Cody's guidance until it held its own weight, without him standing over her shoulder. She painted the walls herself, a soft, warm white that Rosa had helped her pick out at the hardware store, standing in the little room afterward and feeling, for reasons she couldn't quite name, like she was preparing it for someone, though she still had no clear idea who. The garden came in slowly behind the cottage. Tomatoes, beans, a stubborn row of squash that Walt had insisted on planting himself, grumbling the whole time about her spacing being wrong. She started selling a little of the surplus to Rosa's diner, a small, steady trickle of income that meant less of Thomas's money needed spending each week, which mattered to Ellie more than she could easily explain. The money had never felt fully hers, not the way work did. She wanted to build this place as much with her own hands and her own earnings as with a dead man's savings, even if she understood, rationally, that without his savings, none of this would have been possible at all. Word had started to spread through Miller's Bend. the way word does in towns small enough that everyone's business eventually becomes everyone's business. The girl who bought St. Aidan's for $1. The girl who'd fallen through the roof and gotten back up. People she'd never spoken to began stopping by on weekends, not to gawk mostly, though there was some of that early on, but to help, drawn by the particular magnetism of watching something broken get slowly, stubbornly repaired. A retired teacher named Miriam Voss showed up one Sunday with a box of old hymnals she'd kept in her attic for 30 years, in case the church ever needed them again. A teenage boy named Dawson, 16, and restless, and clearly in some kind of trouble Ellie didn't ask about, started coming by after school most days, quiet and awkward, offering to help with whatever needed doing. She recognized something in Dawson she didn't examine too closely at first, a particular guardedness, a way of flinching slightly at kindness, like it might be a trick. She gave him small jobs and didn't push for explanations, the way Dale and Patricia and Rosa had once given her the same grace, and slowly, over the weeks, Dawson started talking. His mother worked 2 jobs. His father wasn't around. He was aging toward 18, with no clear plan for what came after, and something about the church, he admitted once, quietly, made him feel like maybe broken things didn't have to stay broken forever. Ellie recognized the shape of that sentence. It had been hers, once, though she hadn't had anyone to say it to. She didn't make promises to Dawson she wasn't sure she could keep, but she started, without quite deciding to, imagining him as part of whatever this place eventually became. Not a plan yet, just a thread she kept noticing, the same way she'd once noticed the uneven floorboard without understanding what it meant. The 7th week brought the first real cold snap of the season, and with it, a shift in the air that Walt noticed before anyone else did. "Storm season's early this year," he said one afternoon, squinting at a sky that looked, to Ellie's untrained eye, perfectly ordinary. "Feel it in my knees before I ever see it on the news. This one's going to be bad." She didn't think much of it at first. Walt's knees had predicted 3 storms over the past month that had amounted to nothing more than a few hours of rain. But by that evening, the local news Ellie caught on the radio in Dale's station confirmed what Walt's knees had already known. A major storm system building over the plains, expected to hit Miller's Bend and the surrounding counties within the week, with warnings of high winds, flash flooding, and the kind of damage the region hadn't seen in a decade. Ellie stood in the church that night, looking up at the roof she'd repaired with her own 2 hands, at the new windows Hollis had sourced at cost, at 6 weeks of work that had turned a condemned ruin into something sound and whole again. She thought about the choir loft's still unrepaired section, weakened enough by her fall that she'd cordoned it off, rather than risk it again before she had time to fix it properly. She thought about the cottage's roof, patched, but not yet fully replaced. She thought about the garden, weeks from harvest, that a flash flood could wipe out in a single night. She'd built something real here, in 6 weeks, out of nothing but $1 and a dead man's savings, and a town's slowly gathered kindness. She understood, standing there with the radio's storm warning still echoing in her ears, that all of it, every board she'd nailed, every wall she'd repaired, every fragile unspoken plan she'd started building toward Dawson and whoever else might someday need this place, was about to be tested against something far bigger than a rotted roof plank or a twisted ankle. She thought of Thomas Whitfield's letter, of the particular kind of faith it took to spend 40 years building toward a moment you'd never live to see. She hadn't had 40 years. She'd had 6 weeks, and a great deal of help she was only beginning to understand she'd needed. It would have to be enough. She spent the next 3 days in a focused, unglamorous scramble, securing what she could, reinforcing what she couldn't fully protect, moving what mattered most out of the cottage's more vulnerable corners. Walt showed up unasked, as he'd started doing for most things now, bringing sandbags and a trailer full of plywood. Hollis sent Cody out with a truckload of supplies and refused, again, to let Ellie pay for any of it. Dawson skipped school one day to help haul sandbags along the church's foundation, working until his hands blistered the way Ellie's once had, and didn't complain once. By the evening the storm was due to hit. Ellie stood on the cottage porch with Walt beside her, watching a sky gone the color of a fresh bruise, greenish and heavy and wrong in a way that made the hair on her arms stand up. "Whatever happens," Walt said, gruff, not quite looking at her, "you didn't build something that falls down easy. Remember that, whatever the next few hours bring." Ellie wanted to believe him. Standing there, watching the storm roll in, low and dark, over land that had been worthless 6 weeks ago and was, now, unmistakably hers, she found she almost did. The storm hit Miller's Bend a little after 9 that night, and it hit harder than even Walt's knees had predicted. Ellie had spent the last hour before it arrived doing a final check of the church and cottage, flashlight in hand, the wind already picking up enough to make the walk between buildings feel like wading through something solid. She'd secured the loose plywood over the choir loft's weakened section, double-checked the sandbags along the foundation, and moved the garden's last unharvested vegetables into the cottage in case the wind took the rest. By the time she made it back to the cottage porch, rain had started coming in sideways, and the sky had gone from bruised green to a churning, featureless black. The power went first, sometime around 10, plunging the whole property into a darkness broken only by her flashlight and the intermittent, sickly flash of lightning. She sat by the cottage window for a while, watching the storm work at the church's steeple, half expecting to see it torn away entirely, and it was somewhere in that hour of watching, helpless, that she heard the sound she'd been dreading, without quite letting herself name it. A deep, groaning crack from the direction of the church, audible even over the wind. She was out the door before she'd fully decided to go, flashlight beam swinging wild against sheets of rain, and what she found when she reached the church confirmed the worst of what she'd feared. A section of the newly repaired roof, weakened by wind she hadn't accounted for, had partially given way over the choir loft, the same loft she'd fallen through weeks earlier, now sagging dangerously under the weight of rain pooling where shingles had torn free. And beneath it, she realized with a jolt of pure horror, was Dawson. He'd stayed later than she'd known, she would learn afterward, had come back after dinner to help finish securing the last of the plywood, and gotten caught by the storm's sudden arrival, sheltering in the church, rather than risk the walk home, in what had quickly become a genuine emergency. He was standing near the base of the loft stairs when she found him, flashlight beam catching the fear on his face, calling her name just as another section of the ceiling let go above him. She didn't think. She crossed the nave at a dead run, hit him at the shoulder hard enough to knock them both sideways, and felt the rush of air and debris as a heavy section of roofing timber crashed down exactly where he'd been standing seconds before. They hit the floor together, hard, Ellie's already healed shoulder screaming with fresh pain, but neither of them under the collapsed section, both of them, impossibly, still in one piece. There was no time to feel relieved. The ceiling above the loft was continuing to fail, a widening gap letting rain pour directly into the nave now, and Ellie understood, with the kind of clarity that comes only in genuine emergencies, that the whole choir loft section was at real risk of coming down entirely and possibly taking part of the supporting wall with it. "We need to get clear," she shouted over the storm, hauling Dawson up by his arm, and they half ran, half stumbled toward the main doors, Ellie's flashlight beam bouncing wildly, debris and rain making the familiar nave feel suddenly foreign and dangerous. They made it outside, just as a second, heavier crack sounded behind them, the choir loft, or what remained of it, finally giving way, a section of ceiling and old timber crashing down into the nave in a sound like the whole building groaning in pain. Ellie turned back, heart hammering, half certain she'd see the entire church collapsing behind her, but the walls held. The roof's failure had stayed contained to the loft section, the newer repairs elsewhere holding fast against the storm's worst. She and Dawson sheltered the rest of the night in the cottage, soaked through and shaking, listening to the storm rage on outside without another word between them for a long while. It was Dawson who finally broke the silence, voice small, in a way it hadn't been in weeks. "You could have just left me," he said. "You didn't have to come back for me." Ellie thought about that for a long moment, about 4 foster homes in 7 years, about a mother 12 years gone, and a father who'd never been there to begin with, about every time in her life someone could have come back for her and hadn't. She thought about Thomas Whitfield, dead before she was born, who'd spent 40 years building toward a stranger he'd never lived to meet. "That's not how this place works," she said finally, and found, saying it, that she believed it completely. Not anymore. The storm broke by early morning, moving on toward the next county and leaving Miller's Bend battered but standing. Ellie walked out at first light to survey the damage, Dawson beside her, both of them bracing for the worst. The choir loft was a near total loss, timber and shingle scattered across the nave floor, rain damage soaking into wood she'd only just repaired. It would take weeks, maybe longer, to fix properly, and money she'd have to pull, again, from what remained of Thomas's savings. The cottage roof had held, barely, the patch job she'd done weeks earlier, surviving by what felt like sheer stubbornness. The garden was flattened, most of it, weeks of careful work reduced to mud and broken stalks. It should have felt, standing there in the wreckage, like the money pit Walt had once called it, proof that everyone who doubted her had been right all along. Instead, surveying the damage with Dawson silent and shaken beside her, Ellie felt something closer to certainty than despair. The building had held, not perfectly, not without real loss, but it had held where it mattered, because 6 weeks of honest work had gone into making sure it could, and more than that, she had held. She'd run toward danger instead of away from it, without a single second of hesitation, for a 16-year-old boy who wasn't hers by any measure, but the one that had come to matter most. That's not how this place works. Not anymore. She understood, standing in the wreckage of the choir loft, with dawn breaking grey and clean over Miller's Bend, that she'd meant those words for herself as much as for Dawson. The town came together in the days after the storm, the way small towns do, when something worth saving is threatened, not all at once, not with fanfare, but steadily, the way water finds its way into every crack of a thing, until the whole structure is somehow held together by it. Hollis showed up the morning after with a truckload of salvaged lumber before Ellie had even finished assessing the damage, waving off her protests with the same gruffness he'd used weeks earlier over a load of nails. Cody brought 2 other roofers he knew from neighboring towns, men who worked the choir loft's rebuild for cost of materials only, because Cody had told them the story. apparently, and they'd wanted to be part of it. Rosa fed half of Miller's Bend out of her diner that week, refusing payment from anyone working on the church, absorbing the cost into whatever quiet ledger she kept of debts she considered worth carrying. Miriam Voss organized a collection at what remained of the town's community board, and Patricia Hollis, of all people, coordinated a small fundraiser through the county office that raised more in a single weekend than Ellie would have guessed the whole town had to spare. Walt didn't say much through any of it. He simply showed up every day, worked longer hours than men half his age, and treated the church's recovery as though it were his own land under threat, which, in every way that mattered by then, it might as well have been. It took 3 weeks to rebuild the choir loft properly. Stronger this time, reinforced in ways the original structure never had been, built by more hands than Ellie could have imagined asking for on her own. Dawson worked beside her nearly every day after school, quieter than before in some ways, but steadier too, like the night of the storm had settled something in him, the same way it had settled something in her. It was in the middle of that rebuild, sawdust and late autumn light filling the nave, that Ellie finally said out loud the plan she'd been carrying quietly for weeks. She wanted to turn St. Aidan's into a place for kids like Dawson, like she had been once. Not a group home, not exactly, but somewhere close. A foundation offering a room, a meal, honest work, and the particular, unglamorous dignity of being trusted with responsibility for teenagers aging out of foster care or falling through whatever cracks the system left uncovered. She wanted the cottage's second room, the one she'd painted without knowing why, to be the first of several. She wanted the garden rebuilt bigger, workable enough to teach kids something real with their hands. She wanted the church itself, once fully restored, to hold gatherings again. Not services necessarily, but the same kind of community Thomas Whitfield had spent 40 years quietly building, just aimed at people who needed exactly what she'd once needed, and never had. She told Walt first, half expecting the old skepticism to resurface. Instead, he was quiet a long moment, working his jaw, and then said only, "Thomas would have liked that," in a voice rougher than usual, and went back to hammering, without further comment, which Ellie had learned by now was Walt's version of full-throated approval. Dale cried a little when she told him, which surprised them both, and pretended afterward that it had been dust from the shelves. The Miller's Bend Foundation for New Beginnings opened its doors, quietly, the following spring, exactly 1 year after Ellie Rosewood had first climbed the church's cracked stone steps with $9 and a duffel bag. Dawson was the first official resident, moving into the cottage's second room with a duffel bag of his own, considerably less battered than Ellie's had been, but not by much. 2 more kids followed within the month, referred through the county, each of them carrying some version of the same guardedness Ellie remembered too well from her own life, each of them, slowly, finding their way towards something steadier under this church's newly sound roof. Thomas Whitfield's money hadn't lasted forever. Most of it had gone, by the end, into the rebuild, the foundation's early operating costs, the beginnings of what Ellie hoped would grow into something self-sustaining through the garden, the workshop Hollis had helped her set up in the old lean-to, the small odd-job network Rosa and Dale, and half the town, seemed happy to funnel toward the kids who needed both the income and the sense of purpose it brought. But the money, Ellie understood now in a way she hadn't fully understood the day she'd first counted it on the nave floor, had never really been the point. Thomas had told her as much himself, in careful, old-fashioned handwriting, and it had taken her a year of blistered hands and rebuilt roofs to understand exactly what he meant. The gift was never the money. It was the chance, the ground under her feet, and everything she'd chosen to build on top of it. She kept Thomas's letter framed now, hung near the church's entrance where anyone walking in could read it, because she'd come to believe the words weren't only meant for her. Buildings like this one have a way of waiting for the person who needs them most. She thought that was true of the church. She'd come to believe it was true of towns, too, and of people, that everyone was, in their own way, a little like St. Aidan's had been, written off by some, worth saving to those patient enough to look closer, waiting for someone willing to do the work of proving the doubters wrong. Your starting point doesn't have to be your ending. Ellie Rosewood had learned that the hard way, on a night with $9 and nowhere else to go, and she spent every day since trying to make sure the kids who found their way to St. Aidan's learned it a little easier than she had. If this story moved you tonight, we'd love to hear from you. Tell us in the comments what starting over has meant in your own life, and if you believe some places really do wait for the person who needs them most. And if you want more stories like Ellie's, make sure you're subscribed, because there's always another one waiting to be told.